Shavua Tov. We're up to Daf Nun Tes Amud Beis, and we're going to skip the Hakdama. Maybe we'll get a chance to do that later because I don't have access right now to the Sift on Zvachim. And the Gemara says on the second line, Amalei Rav Shemen Bar Abel Rav Papa Lididoch Di Amrit Male Umalina Barosho Shal Mizbeach Haimin V'Avdin Milsa Lakonim Di Osube Lidei Takola. If you recall, Rav Papa is of the opinion in interpreting Rabbi Shmuel that the Mitzvah is going to bring his carbon chatos and do the shchita and the zrika following the Tamid Shel Bein Arbayim. And that's not a problem, even if it's a chatos behema. But the Haktar Seimurim will be delayed until the next morning, after the Tamid Shel Shach. And although the Haktar Seimurim hasn't been implemented yet, but nevertheless, the Mitzorah has now brought his kapara and completed his Tara process, Tikni Kodjim. And the reason for that is because even though normally we would say that the Achilas Ha'emurim Al Yidei HaKonim is absolutely critical to complete the kapara, and that's called Kohanim Ochlim U'Bailim Iskaprim. But as we discussed on Yom Chamishi, once the Achilas HaKohanim is impossible, in this case Haktar Seimurim is impossible, it's like it was Nevad or Nitma, and therefore the kapara is clinched even without the Haktar Seimurim. So the Kohanim will bring the Emurim tomorrow after the Tamid Shel Shachar, but as far as the Mitzvah is concerned, he's brought his carbon. The Zrika will clinch the kapara. He's allowed to eat kodshim, and that's fine. But Rav Shemen is bothered by the following. You're taking the Emurim and you're placing them al Rosh Shel Mizbeach. The Kohanim are very, very busy, and they're involved in many, many different activities and bringing different emurim for different karbanos on the Ma'aracha, and inadvertently they may, without even being aware of the fact that these particular emurim from the kapara of the Mitzorah are not to be placed on the Ma'aracha, and by doing so will be a violation of the Easter of Hashlama, the Lav Haba Mechalesi of Hashlama. If they were to, burn the emurim today, meaning as far as all karbanos is concerned, the emurim could be burnt on the Ma'aracha even after the Tamid Shel Bein Arbayim. That's not a problem. But in this particular case, where the shchita and the zrika were implemented after the Tamid Shel Bein Arbayim, then it's critical that Aktaras emurim of this particular karban, the Chatos Mitzorah, will be delayed until tomorrow and not be burnt on the Mizbeach today, because in doing so, that would undermine the Lav Haba Mechalesi, violate the Lav of Hashlama. So now the Gemara is upset because you're putting the Kohanim in a very difficult position. How do they know to differentiate between these emurim that belong to the carbon that was shechted and had the Zrika Sadam after the Tamid Shel Bein Arbayim, as opposed to those karbanos that were brought before the Tamid Shel Bein Arbayim? All the emurim it's confusing, and even if they put it in a bag with a sign on it, but nevertheless the Kohanim might be mistaken. So why create such a possible takala? This Savre, the Gemara says, Avdina Milsa L'Kohanim Diavdebei takala is Savre the Yomehu, because the Kohanim mistakenly think that this bag of emurim is the Yomei, meaning that the carbon was brought Kedasu Kedin before the Tamid Shel Bein Arbayim. So since during the entire course of the night, the Kohanim are busy being maktir, the chalovim and the ivarim of karbonos that were brought, they were shechted and they had the zrikas adam before the Talmud Shel Ben Abayim, those are properly being brought on the mizbeach, on the maroch. They're going to think that even these chalovim that are shayach to karbonos of the chatas mitzora, which was shechted after the korban Talmud Shel Ben Abayim, belong to the same category. They fit the same bill, the same profile as all the other emurim that can be brought and must be brought during the course of the night on the mizbeach. Or a Papa responds to Rav Shemin, and he says, Kohanim's reason. We have a principle that the Kohanim are very careful. We discussed this in great length when we learned the Masechet Eruvin during the last Mishnayos of Eruvin. The Mishnayos ram into our heads, this principle of Ein Shmutz B'Mikdash, because Kohanim's reason. Here too, the Kohanim are very meticulous, very careful. We don't have to be concerned that they may inadvertently take these imurim and burn them on top of the mizbeach. So therefore, we can assume that the Kohanim will notify one or the other. They'll work in tandem as a group, as a chabura, and one will notify the other that these imurim have to be reserved and postponed until tomorrow. Amalei Rav Ashi Rav Kahana, V'Amri Rav Huna Breid Ravi Nasan Rav Papa. So now the question is being addressed to Rav Papa himself. He's the one who's responsible for this whole sugya. And the question is, how does the shechita of the karbonos with the zrikas adam, is that enough for generating a kapor? And that's where we had this whole sugya that we saw on Yom Chamishi, and we came to the conclusion that we don't have to worry about the fact that the Kohanim will not be able to eat a murim because it's like it was nevad. Now what we're up to is Rav Kahana. So I would ask you to look at the line in the Gemara that parallels Tosfos Dibur Maskil, Velo Olas Achol. Rav Kahana raises the following contradiction. With regard to Karban Chagiga, in Shmos Perek Chav Gimel, Ksiv, the Torah says, Lo Yolin Chelev Chagi Ad Boker. And we're talking about the Isser of Halonas HaKarban, to leave the Karban over to the next day. In this case, the context is the Karban Chagiga. And Rav Kahana says that it would seem from this pasuk Ad Haboker Hu de Lo Yolin, that the Isser is only if he leaves the Imurim without Aktorah until Boker, until the next morning. He's allowed to be melin, he's allowed to leave over and delay the process of Aktorah with regard to the Imurim during the entire course of the night. And it would seem that the Imurim are not on top of the Mizbeach in this particular case, they're even what we call Lamata min Mizbeach. So that as far as the Aktorah Imurim is concerned, as long as he gets under the wire. I mean, the last moment here is Alosa Shachar. So before the Alosa Shachar, he'll be Mala de Murim and be Maktir there. Now, let's compare this pasuk, says Rav Kahana, to the pasuk in the context of Talmud Shel Shachar. Ksiv there, the Torah says, at the beginning of Sefer Yikra, it says, Vehiktir oleh chelvei hashlamim. And from this we derive the principle that we've been operating with about Hashlama, Oleh Hashleim Kol HaKarbanot Kulo, that the last carbon of the day should be the Talmud Shel Shachar. After the Talmud Shel Ben Abayim, after the Talmud Shel Ben Abayim, you're not allowed to be maktir anything. So how are we going to understand the pasuk of Lo Yolim, which we started with here, that implies that you're allowed to be maktir during the entire course of the night And who most of love who mefarik. Rav Kana asked this question and he answered it. Kisheni tosru. In other words, if the karbonos were brought before the Tamid Shel Bein Arbaim, but the imurim of these karbonos that were shechted before the Bein Arbaim were not yet burnt on the Mizbeach. The Haktorah of these imurim did not yet take place. And in the meantime, they brought the Tamid Shel Bein Arbaim. In such a case, you're allowed to be maktir even after the Haktorah's Tamid Shel Bein Arbaim, because these karbonos were re'uyim faktorah. You could have been maktir them before the Tamid Shel Bein Arbaim, and that locks it into place so that the Haktorah could take place even after the Tamid Shel Bein Arbaim, during the course of the entire night. As opposed to a case where, as we discussed earlier, where the Shechita and the Zrika took place after the Tamid Shel Bein Arbaim, then the Haktorah cannot be implemented during the course of the day. It's going to undermine the lava b'machal, violate the lava b'machal essay of Hashlam. Rami le Rav Safra l'Rav. Rav Safra asked the following stira in Psukim to Rav. As far as Korban Pesach, which is of course shechted on the 14th of Nisan, Ksiv, the Torah says, Lo yolid la boker zevach chag haPasach. Now this pasuk is in Shmos, and there in Parshas Kitisa, it says that there's an Itzer Halana, and we're talking about the Korban Pesach. La Boker, but the Torah emphasizes that the Itzer Halana is violated La Boker if we leave the meat over to the next morning, Hu Delo Yolid. So if he delays Haktar Saimurim of the Korban Pesach until the next morning, he violates this law. Akala Lailo Yolid. But the Torah apparently permits you to leave the Emurim of the Korban Pesach and be maktir them sometime before daybreak, before Alos HaShachar, but during the course of the night, he's allowed to do so. Now let's talk about the 15th of Nisan. The 15th of Nisan is Yontif. And now he's delaying the Haktorah Seimurim of the Korban Pesach, which was a carbon of Yudalid, until the next morning, until Tesvav. Well, that's Yontif. Vaksiv. The Torah says, Olas Shabbos b'Shabbat, v'lo Olas Chol b'Shabbos, v'lo Olas Chol b'Yontif. How can you possibly delay the Haktorah Seimurim and implement that on Yontif when the carbon itself is a carbon of Yudalit? It's basically an Olas Chol, and an Olas Chol does not override the Shabbos. Olas Shabbos violates the Shabbos, and that's fine. Same thing with Yontif. But to take the carbon of the 14th of Nisan, which is a Friday, not really, I don't mean it's a Friday, but I mean to say it's Erev Yontif, and delay the Haktorah of that Chol carbon until Yontif, how are you going to implement the Haktorah on Yontif? It's not Olas Shabbos b'Shabbato. It's Olas Chol b'Yontif. Or Malay, so he answered, Kvar Ramye Niala, Rav Abba bar Chia. The same question was asked earlier by Rav Abba bar Chia, Rabbi Avo, of Rabbi Avo. The Shani, and here's what Rabbi Avo responded. Hacha, in the pasuk Lo Yolin La Boker, Zevach Chag Pesach. That pasuk was not addressing the case of every single Korban Pesach, but rather Bi'arbasa Shechalios B'Shabbos Haskim. Here's where the Torah says that you can delay the Haktorah until the next morning, and that's a case of Arbasar on Shabbos. If Arbasar on Shabbos, then it becomes a carbon of Shabbos, and then we can apply the principle of Ola Shabbos b'Shabbato, and we can be maktir the Murim of the Korban Pesach on the night of Yontif, which in this case is Shabbos, Why? Because the Chelvei Shabbos craven beyontif. We can be makdir the chalovim of a cover that was shechted on Shabbos. So our basa was on Shabbos, and now we're going to implement Torah on Yontif, right? Will be Motzi Shabbos will be Yontif, and that's fine because you're allowed to be makdir on Yontif Chelvei Shabbos. You and I would have said logically, maybe it's not called Chelvei Shabbos because it's not really a carbon that's generated by Shabbos. It happens to be Shabbos, but it's really generated by Chol, by Yudalit. But no, once it became a carbon of Shabbos, because the carbon was brought on Shabbos, now it takes on the status of Ola Shabbos, and you could do the Torah on Yom. Amalei, so Rav responds to Rav Safra, Bishum de Chelvei Shabbos Kraven Beyontif. In other words, the pasuk itself doesn't indicate in any way that it's a reference to a case where our basar is on Shabbos. Now we're going to interpret the pasuk as of Lo Yolid LaBoker Zeva Chag Pesach, as if the pasuk is addressing only this case exclusively, where our basar b'nisan is chal on Shabbos. That's certainly not the simple understanding of the pasuk. The pasuk seems to be referring to every single Korban Pesach. The pasuk doesn't qualify. Amalei, so Rav Safra responds to Rava, Shavke lekra tehu dochik umukim anafshe. It's leave the pasuk that we have a difficulty, and there's a stira psukim. So the pasuk is if implicitly or almost explicitly refers to Erev Pesach Shchalios B'Shabbos, because otherwise there's no way of reconciling the apparent contradiction in the psukim. And now we're ready to start the Mishnah on Daf Nun Tesamid Beis towards the bottom of the Amud. We need a long introduction to this Mishnah, but because of the technical challenges here, I'm able to use this room for a short amount of time. We'll just jump straight through the Mishnah, and then believe me, we'll try to find an opportunity to fill in some of the introductory background. The Mishnah says the following: Pesach sheshchato shelo lishmo v'kibel v'hilech v'zorak shelo lishmo o lishmo v'shelo lishmo o shelo lishmo v'lishmo possible. So the Reisha of the Mishnah is less important for us for the sugya than the Sefer. Let's just go quickly over the Reisha. The Reisha addresses the case where he shechted the Korban Pesach for the purpose of a Korban Shlomim, and he likewise was Makabel Adam of the Pesach. He did the Halacha, the Zrika. All of this was Shalol L'Shem Pesach, El L'Shem Shlom. And this is going to be the psul of Shalol L'Shmo. Now, the part of the Mishnah that is going to occupy our minds is the L'Shmo v'Shalol L'Shmo, or Shalol L'Shmo v'L'Shmo. And in the various cases here in the Sefer of the Mishnah, which the Mishnah itself is going to delineate, he has one machshava of L'Shma and one machshava Shalol L'Shma. Eitzad, L'Shmo v'Shalol L'Shmo means L'Shem Pesach and L'Shem Shlom. And the reverse, Shalol L'Shmo v'L'Shmo, is L'Shem Shlom v'L'Shem Pesach. So it means, what was the sequence? Did he start with the right kavanah, the machshava of L'Shma, and then he went into machshava Shalol L'Shma, or the other way around? And in either case, it's possible. Boy Rav Papa. Rav Papa raises the following suffix. Bi'avoda achas tnan o b'shtei avodos tnan. When the Mishnah speaks about these two kavanos, a machshava of Lishmo, the Shalol Lishmo, these two machshavas, Was it during the course of one single machshava, one single avoda, or he had a machshava of lishmo for one avoda and shalol lishmo for another avoda? And now the Gemara analyzes the tzadei asaf. Ba'avoda achas tnan, if we're talking about two machshavas, two contradictory, mutually exclusive machshavas in the same avoda, then Rabbi Yossi, we have no choice but to assume that this Mishnah reflects the Shita of Rabbi Yossi. And here we need a background. There's a machlokas between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir with regard to Tmura. If a person had two machshavas that are mutually exclusive, Rabbi Meir says, Tfotz Lachon Rishon. Whatever he thought at the beginning, that's what he had in mind. And the conclusion of his statement is Batel or Mavutal. Rabbi Yossi says, no, we have to take into consideration both machshavas. Okay, let's see how this fleshes out in the case of Tmura. That's the original machlok between Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Meir, and then we'll try to apply it to our Mishnah of Korban Pesach Lishmo and Shalol Lishmo. Rabbi Yossi di Amar Af Bigmar Dvarav Adam Nitvas. A person had two statements that are mutually exclusive. We will combine the two. In other words, both the Reisha and the Seif of what he said are valid. For example, he starts and he declares Behemoth Zu Tmuras Ola. And then he says Tmuras Shlomin. According to Rabbi Yossi, this animal now becomes part Ola and part Shlomin, because Af Bigmar Dvarav Adam Nitvas. So we take into consideration his entire declaration, even Sof Dvarav. Half of the behemoth becomes a Tmuras Ola, the other half becomes a Tmuras Shlomin. And now if we apply that to our Mishnah, Rabbi Yossi would make sense if we attribute the Mishnah to him, in the case of Lishma and Shalom in the same avoda. Because whatever statement he made at the beginning or at the end, whether it was Lishmo at the beginning, Shalol Lishmo at the end, or the other way around, he started with Shalol Lishmo, it doesn't matter because he has a machshava poseles. He's got a machshava which is Shalol Lishma and undermines the kashrus of the korban. So, for example, it makes sense if he started with a machshava of Lishmo, and then in that same avoda, he changed his channel, and now he has machshava Shalol Lishmo. And according to Rabbi Yossi, Af Bigmar Dvarav Adam Nitfas. So that means that when he concludes by saying Shalol Lishmo, that's also an integral part of the machshava, or the other way around. Let's say he started with the machshava of Shalol Lishmo, then for sure within that avoda, the avoda was done Shalol Lishma. Once it's a Shalol Lishma in the avoda, that passes the avoda and the korban is possible. The Rabbi Meir, but if you're going to argue that our Mishnah can reconcile itself with Rabbi Meir, Ha'amar Tfotz Lachon Rishon. Rabbi Meir always validates your original language and disqualifies the second. What you thought at the beginning, that's going to engrave everything in stone. So it makes sense that if he started with a machshav shalol lishmo in Korban Pesach, that's going to passel the korban. But if he started with a machshav lishmo, which is one of the cases listed in the Mishnah, why is the Korban Pesach passel according to Rabbi Meir? Now, getting back to the case of Tmura, as we apply Rabbi Meir in the original context, he started up with a machshava rishona, and he said that harezu tmuras olam. And even though he completed his statement by saying tmura shlamim, it will be a tmuras olam, 100%. And the other way around, if he started with tmura shlamim. Therefore, in our case, in our Mishnah, where he had two machshavas hasos rezuazu in one single avoda, we're going to take his first machshava. If he thought at the beginning of his shechita, for example, he was shechti l'shem Pesach, and then he shifted over to L'Shem Shlomim, we would be machshir the carbon. And that's against our Mishnah, because our Mishnah says, O Lishmo v'Shalo Lishmo Pasul. So that's the final conclusion if we assume that the Mishnah is talking about a case of Avoda Achas. And if it's Avoda Achas, we cannot reconcile our Mishnah with Rabbi Meir for one fundamental reason, because the Mishnah undermines the kashrus of the Korban Pesach if he started with a machshava l'shmo, because he ended with a machshava shelo l'shmo. But that's only in the same avodah. Is there a way of reinterpreting the Mishnah so that it can be reconciled with Rabbi Meir? And the answer is very much yes. O Dilma, let's reinterpret our Mishnah. B'shtei avodos t'nan. Our Mishnah is talking about a case where he had two different machshavos that are contradictory, but in two different avodos. Is hafilu Rabbi Meir the Yom Tzvos Lashon Rishon Hani Mili be'avoda Achas Avol b'shtei avodos Mode de Mifsa, meaning that whichever one of these two avodos had a machshava shelo lishma l'shem shlomim, that machshava now passes that avoda, let it be shchita, let it be zrika, holacha, whatever it might be. And once one of the avodos is an avoda poseles, then the carbon is possible. So even if his original machshava, let's say during the shchita, was l'shem pesach, but when he got to the zrika, he had a machshava l'shem shlomim, the zrika itself sets itself up as a separate entity, and that avoda was implemented with a machshava haposelis. So even Rabbi Meir, who says Tfos Lashon Rishon, that's only within the same avoda. But from one avoda to the other, each avoda presents itself as a separate, independent entity. And if the avoda was implemented with a machshava, in this case of Pesach L'Shem Shlomim, machshava Shelo Lishma, that's going to undermine the psul of the carbon. Now the Gemara tries to clarify this. Amri Ahei. With regard to what din in our Mishnah does Rav Papa present his suffix? Remember, this whole suffix was that of Rav Papa. Inema, if we're going to say Ashalo Lishmo Ulishmo, that if we're talking about a case where he had a machshava of Shalo Lishmo and then Lishmo, then bein bi'avoda achas ubein b'shtei avodos. In other words, he started with a machshava shelo lishmo, bein l'Rabbi Meir, bein l'Rabbi Yossi, if solei mikamaisa. Once he had a machshava of shelo lishma, that passes the carbon. Now, it matters not whether this is a case of one avoda or two avodas. And for that matter, it doesn't matter whether you're going according to Rabbi Yotzi or according to Rabbi Meir. Even if I hold like Rabbi Meir that we take Tfos Lashon Rishon, here his Lashon Rishon was a machshava shelo lishma. How much more so if it was a case of two avodos? Certainly Rabbi Meir would say that since he did avoda number one with a machshava poselos of shelo lishma, the carbon is possible. Tohal Rabbi Yossi Nami. Af bigmar dvarav adam nitfas isle. In other words, Rabbi Yossi accepts everything that he had in mind at the beginning and at the end. So when he says bigmar dvarav adam nitfas, Abai points out that we shouldn't reinterpret it, we shouldn't misinterpret it as the last machshava is the only machshava that's valid, that registers on the Richter scale. He means to say, Rabbi Yossi, that af the Gemara Dvar of Adam Nitfas and the Gemara Dvar of the last machshava is also very important. And therefore, in that case that we discussed, where he had a machshava of Shelo Lishmo and Lishmo, although his last machshava does register, but his first machshava already passes the carbon. Ela ashal al lishmo v'shalo lishmo. The suffix of Papa refers specifically to the case of shalol where he starts with lishmo and he ends with shalol lishmo. If he starts with a machshav of lishmo, what's the din over here? If the Mishnah is referring to avoda achas, then we can reconcile our Mishnah only with Rav Yossi, but not with Rabbi Meir, because again we're talking about a case of lishmo and shalol lishmo. And if it's avoda achas, then Rabbi Meir is going to say in that case that the korban is kosher. So from this point on, the Gemara introduces one brisa and then another, an analysis of our Mishnah, the diuk of our Mishnah, in order to come to some conclusion with regard to Rav Papa's song. I see we have a few minutes left for a little bit of background information, and we're going to say the following, that there are three different categories of machshava with regard to kodshim and in general, as far as kodshim is concerned, three different categories of machshava poselis. First of the three is what we call chutz lizmano, and the Kohen had a machshava during one of the four major avodos that he would do the zrika fully achar zmano, meaning that the haktaras murim would be after its time allotted, or the korban should be eaten beyond its time allotted. So that's what we call the chamura shebekulam. That's the worst machshava that you could have. And it's called machshavas pigul. It passes the korban. It goes out to the beis hasreifa. If you eat from the korban, then you chayv kares. And this psul is derived from a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Zayin. Ve'im he'achel yachel mipsar zevach shloma b'yom hashlishi lo yiratzeh and lo yichashev pigul yeh va'nefesh ha'ocheles mimenu avono tisa. And the Gemara darshans that this is a reference to the psul machshava of chutz lizmano. Then we go down one notch, and we have a machshava posels, which is called chutz limkomo. And the Kohen makriv, and let's say for example, he does his rikas adam, or at the time of that korban say murim, and he has in mind that it would be shalom limkomo, out of its location, or that the korban itself will be eaten outside of its specific limited location. This machshav is a little bit less severe than chutz lizmano, but nevertheless it does passel the korban. Korban has to be taken out to the beis hasreifa, and it's not called a machshavas pigul as far as the iser kares if somebody eats the bus. Then we get to the lowest level, the third level of machshava poseles, and that's what we call shinui Hashem. That during the course of the avodah, the Kohen thought that he's doing the avodah for the sake of a different korban, not this korban, or for bailim acherim, for a different person who was not the owner of this korban. Now here, the laws of a machshavas shini Hashem change depending upon which korban you're talking about. In most korbanos, then what we say is that the korban is kosher in a case of machshava shini Hashem, and we go ahead with aktorah and we eat it kedino, but it's not ola lebailim l'shem chov. They'll have to bring another korban to replace this one and fulfill their obligation. That's as far as most korbanos are concerned, and a machshava of shini Hashem only undermines the ritzui korban on behalf of the Baal. As far as the korban itself is concerned, it's kosher. However, korban Pesach, and another exception is going to be korban chatos, and the Gemara in Zvachim says that these are psulim legamre. In other words, we take the korban out to the beis hasreifa. And the reason for this distinction of Pesach and chatos from all the other korbanos is because of the pasuk with regard to korban Pesach. In Dvarim Perek Zayin it says, Shimru Shamoras HaChodesh HaAviv The Asisa Pesach Hashem Elokecha. And the Gemara in Tzvachim Daf Zayin says that from the language of the pasuk we see that a machsheves shinui korban is ma'akev in the korban Pesach. And the pasuk says in Shmos Perek Yud Beis, "V'amartem zevach Pesach hu Hashem." And the Gemara says that the pasuk indicates that the machsheves shinui bailin is absolutely critical in the korban with regard to the korban Pesach. As far as korban chatas is concerned, the Gemara there in Zvachim derives that from other psukim that a machshevet shini Hashem in the case of a korban chatas post selah. So this din of machshava that's here in our Mishnah with regard to a korban Pesach is something that we'll learn again in the beginning of Masechet Zvachim. So let's just make a note of where we got up to. We're up to Toshma here on Daf Samach Amud Aleph, and in Mitzvah Hashem B'li Neder we'll continue in the next year, starting with Toshma. So thank everyone, and Shavua Tov again.